Welcome to today's Science Talks, and we're live from Bloxhub and have really looked forward to today. A warm welcome to you all watching us, participating through our YouTube link, and a huge welcome to Naja Lind, who is actually with me here in the studio. And you're our speaker today. A warm welcome, and thank you for joining us. And we continue our science talk today, and we're still focusing on circularity in urban design and the built environment. And where we in our previous science talks have focused on the impetus and the need for the change and insurance and implementation of circularity, and also the ways in which data mapping and technological advances can assist in that change, we're changing the focus just a little bit. We have a different perspective today. Before we go to that, I'd like to just welcome you to people that you can't see, but without whom we would not be able to do this today. And it's the Bloxhub crew sitting behind the scene. We have Melde in our tech room running the show, as it were, and we have Helle and Malene on the YouTube chat, helping to, if you have any questions or queries as we continue our talk, feel free to raise them in our chat. We do know that the YouTube chat require a login, and apologies for those of you who do not have one. But for those of you who do, please avail of it as much as you want to during the talk, because we also have questions and answers and a debate later on planned. Before I introduce Naja, we would like actually to engage you in a small reflection exercise. So what we'll do is, if you go to the website menti.com and enter a code 7579, and you will actually enter a link where you see a question. And the question is, what are the most important aspects to ensure the circular economy to you? And I have given you the opportunity to enter 3 words, and you can submit them, and then we will show you the word cloud as you have had 30 seconds to submit your input. Yeah, so we'll just let you ponder on that for a second. This is excellent, and we can see a lot of input from you guys, so thank you very, very much. We'll get back to this later on during the science talks. A few facts before I let Naja continue with the presentation. Some of you already know this, but regarding urban development and urban design, by 2050, it's expected that 2/3 of us live in cities, and our current linear economy, the make waste economy model, as it were, means that cities consume over 75% of natural resources. We produce over 50% of the global waste, and it is estimated that we emit 60 to 80% of greenhouse gases. In China alone, it is expected that cities will be built and rebuilt in a number that most of us cannot fathom. part of the statistics that I consulted prior to our talk today, listed numbers of 400 cities, new cities, to be built by the end of this year. Furthermore, the cities in China have to be rebuilt because they have been constructed in materials that we know will not last for more than 30 years. Furthermore, we have a migration to cities in Africa, so where there are also a huge amount of cities that will be built. And these cities are expected to house 1 to 1.5 million people. So the need for circularity is quite evident. And what we're doing today is we're trying to take a step behind the scene, as it were, and look at the potential biases that we can find in decision-making processes and design-making processes. And hopefully the reasons why will become quite clear during Naja's presentation. So without further ado, Naja, a huge welcome to you. And we've really looked forward to this. And I'll let you take over and start your presentation. So welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Pernille. And I just want to say thanks to all of you joining us today. I've been really looking forward to this and to diving deeper into the areas of diversity and circularity. And also just the reason why we are here today is because Pernille and I had a cup of coffee and we started talking about, well, diversity and circularity. And we wondered, basically we had this question that how can we come up with new ideas if we keep thinking the same way? So that was the starting point of doing this science talk. So that's also what we will be diving into today. And that's why we also titled it like how can we be circular if we're stuck in squares? I just want to do a brief disclosure. I am in no ways an expert in circular economy. I'm not even within design, architecture, construction, anything like that. I'm here today to talk about gender and about bias, stereotypes, norms, and together with you and with Pernille, try to place this discussion within the context of circularity. So let me just introduce myself. My name is Naja Lind. I'm an anthropologist and a podcaster. I'm self-employed. I have the company called Lind Perspective, where I do qualitative evaluation studies. But the main reason why I'm here today is because I'm one of 2 producers of the podcast Karrierekvinder, Career Women, where I've spent the last 2.5 years, and I counted 1,443 hours studying, discussing topics within gender, diversity, etc. Before I dive more into this, I just want to take you through the agenda for my presentation. So first, we will be talking, or I will be sharing some of the learnings from Karrierekvinder. Then we will look into what is a bias and what does bias do to us. And then also what do bias do to our design processes and our decision-making process. And as Pernille mentioned before, please, if you have any questions along the way, just use the chat function. So this is Rikke, my partner in crime, and I. And this is our logo and boobs on a briefcase. And well, I'm 34 years old. I'm self-employed. I studied anthropology. I lived abroad a couple of years. I traveled a lot. But I always felt very proud and also very privileged to grow up in Denmark, where we have free education, we have equal rights, where you can be whatever you want to be. So honestly, I never really cared a lot about gender issues in Denmark. Of course, I did at a more global level in countries where women do not have the same legal rights as men. But I was thinking in Denmark we are pretty well off, right? So this is where I started. And then this happened. Rikke, my partner, she found a book in the bookshelves in her workplace. And this book is called Handbook for Career Women. And it's basically a book that gives a lot of advices for young women on what to do to climb up the career ladder. And it's pretty stereotypical. So it tells you what kind of earrings to wear. If you're wondering, pearl earrings, if you want to be taken seriously. It tells you to always wear your hair up. It tells you to not order a salad when you're out for business lunch, because then your colleagues or your clients will associate you with their wives. It tells you not to have affairs, not because it's unethical, but because as a woman you cannot focus if you're in love. Whereas for men can have affairs and become better fathers and better leaders. Basically, that's what the book tells us. It's as stereotypical for women as for men. So what we did, and just also to frame this book, it was published in the year 2000, so it's 20 years ago. What we decided to do is to go through each chapter and look into, so how is the situation today in regard to these claims that the book makes. So we spent 2 years looking at different topics. We've talked about ambitions, we talked about glass ceilings, we talked about wages and wage gaps, we talked about dressing and appearance and authority, we talked about maternity leave, and about becoming a mother and wanting to do a career at the same time. So we dived into all these topics, and what we wanted to discover is, so is the book a joke, or are we the joke? Is the joke on us? What we did discover is what I will share with you during the next couple of slides, that the book is very stereotypical, but also it has some truth to it. So it talks a lot about stereotypes, but 20 years ago, a lot of the organizations still were very male dominated. So some of the stereotypes also were true, and you did have to act in a certain way if you wanted to climb the career ladder. However, we also discovered a lot of other things, and I'll share them here with you. So one thing that was very surprising to us is that women are in fact a minority. It's not that, so often when we talk about majority, we think of a minority as being the group that is outnumbered. This is often the case, but not always. Actually, when you talk about majority, it's much more about a power relationship. So it's about a group having the rights to decide what's normal and what is right. And for a minority, the minority is a non-dominating group that does not have the power to define normality. Again, if you look at organization, workforces, for many thousands of years, organizations have been made by men for men. So women have been kind of a minority in this context. And that's important, because with a minority also comes a certain behavior. What we also discovered is that focusing on gender and diversity is important. I discovered that I am actually a feminist. I also discovered that there's a lot you can do at an individual level. So for the first 2 years of the podcast, we were focused on giving advices for women and for men who wanted to enhance their career. However, we also discovered that it's not a matter of fixing the women. It's much more a matter of fixing the system. I mean, you can fix the women until a certain level, and then you have to start looking elsewhere if you really want to change the status quo. And that's actually what we are doing in season 2 of the podcast. Now we are looking instead into the system, and especially we are trying to talk with companies, organizations that are doing something and trying to understand what are they doing, what's working, what are the challenges for reaching more diversity. Also, we discovered or learned that it's not just for the sake of the women or other minorities that you should focus on diversity. It's actually, well, in order to create a better world for everyone, we have to be aware of our biases and be more diverse and inclusive in our understanding of the world. And this is also where I see there's a lot of overlapping with the circular economy. Before diving into the bias part, I just want to share some more learnings or findings from the last 2.5 years. And now I will throw some numbers at you just to explain the situation maybe of equality, diversity in Denmark. So only 3% of Danish men think there is an issue with gender biases. This is a study done by Boston Consulting Group. But, well, bias in general, it's not, we don't really question whether or not biases are real. I mean, it's cognitive science. We know that we have certain patterns that we think that our brains used to think in certain ways. But when it comes to gender biases, apparently in Denmark, we think that, I mean, that's not a problem. Also, 1 out of 6 Danes identify with being a feminist. This is very low compared to other countries. Even in Mexico, they have more feminists than in Denmark. I mean, also percent-wise. And I love Mexico, but Mexico is also the country where the term macho comes from. So still, they have more feminists per capita than here. Then, if you look at the numbers of managers, you can see if you go like from the top down, we have 27% of managers in Denmark are women. If you compare it to the European nation average, we are below. So the European Union average is 37%. If you go a little higher and look at C-level managers, we have 17% women here in Denmark. And then it becomes even worse. So if you look at the 1,200 biggest companies in Denmark, only 7% have a female CEO. Only 6% have a female chair or chairwoman. So, yeah. Danish men only take 9% of the total parental leave. It might be a weird number to put right behind the other numbers, but actually a lot of studies show that a more equal share of the parental leave is one of the biggest driving forces behind reaching more diversity, equality in a country. Again, if we compare with other Scandinavian countries, Sweden, Iceland are about 30%. So there are some huge differences here between Denmark and countries we normally compare ourselves to, but also countries we don't normally compare ourselves to. I like this one quite a lot because the European Union and the European Commission in 2012, they made a survey, a study across different European countries where they asked people across gender, age, industries, positions, are women less interested in responsibility at work than men are? So do women not want to take responsibility when they're at work? In Denmark, 49% think that yes, women are less interested in responsibility at work. I mean, this is really a shocking number to me, especially if you compare it to Germany, the European Union, and especially Sweden. And it's not all the men or all the women answering this. This is both women and men think that women are in general less interested in responsibility. So this is interesting because it tells us something about our cultural beliefs in Denmark and what kind of stereotypes or presumptions we have about gender in regards to doing career. Another thing I discovered is that Denmark has a highly gender segregated workforce. Before we talked about vertical segregation, which is if you look at top level management, but also if you look at the horizontal segregation, we have in the private sector 74% men. In the public sector, we have 78% of the workforce are female. If you look across industries, we have only 4% male nurses. We have 9% women in construction. And 9% is not a lot, but then if you look into what kind of branches within construction, the women, where they are placed, you will see there's a lot of female painters, but in 2016, we had only 90 female electricians, like in total in all of the electrician workforce. We had 41 female carpenters, and we had 20 female masons, like in total. So in regards to formal equality and, well, equality in general, you could say that Denmark is pretty well off. But if you look at the informal equality, we do have some challenges still that we haven't really been willing to address in terms of gender stereotypes, biases, norms, etc. So this is, now I'm kind of wrapping up to the reason why all this gender talk is relevant in regards to circular economy is that the numbers we see in terms of equality in Denmark very much tells us a story that we are still bound by a lot of traditions, norms, stereotypes that influence the way that we think and behave. And this is actually our first guest in season 2 of Karrierekvinder, and I'm very proud that Margrethe Vestager was part of the podcast. One thing she told us is that when we look the same, we think the same, and that's bottom line the challenge about having all these stereotypes and biases that we are not aware of. And we will come back to Margrethe Vestager later on, but first I would like to do a deep dive into bias. I mean, what is actually a bias? You probably heard about Daniel Kahneman and his system 1 and 2, and how, well, what Kahneman did is to show us that our attention is very limited. Some studies even suggest that up to 99% of our mental functioning appears to happen outside our conscious awareness. So 99% of what we are doing, we're not really conscious about. So Kahneman gives this example to explain this. It's a study called The Invisible Gorilla. You might have heard about it. I don't know if otherwise I will explain it to you. What you see here, and I apologize for the bad quality of the picture, but you see a team playing basket. So what the study did was they told a person to watch a video of a basketball game and to focus on only one of the teams. So one team were wearing white shirts, and they told the person to count the passes just between the white team. Midway through the video, a person dressed as a gorilla crosses the court slowly and like punches the chest like a gorilla and leaves. And what happens is that only half of the thousands of people having done this test notice the gorilla. So even though it's so obvious, because our system 2, our very conscious system, is very focused on counting the white team and the passes, we do not notice a gorilla passing by. So this is an example of how our brain works, but also kind of gives you an idea of how a bias works. So I mentioned before the system 1 and 2. Our system 1 is the fast, impulsive, intuitive thinking. System 2 is the slow, reasoning, careful reflections. Also, system 2 is quite lazy, so it lets system 1 do most of the work. It makes sense because every day we collect like millions of impressions as human beings, and we're not capable to process all of them. So we need system 1 to be able to navigate in a complex world. So it's not that one is bad or the other is good, but a bias is an imperfect shortcut, you could say. So it's a way that we don't have to process all of the information, but we can rely on our system 1 to do some of the processing. It's also a way to effectively categorize the world around us, the biases, and they affect the way we act, think, behave. So you can think of this example again, that if you're told to think of an old person of aging, studies show that immediately afterwards you will be likely to walk slower than you would have done otherwise. This is just one way of explaining how the system works, that whatever you're kind of primed with will affect the way you behave afterwards without you necessarily being aware of it. So why is this problematic? It isn't necessarily problematic or bad. I mean, most of the time the biases do help us function, but any shortcut can have pros and cons, and that's also what we will look at now. For example, stereotypes. Stereotypes are snap judgment about other people. And stereotypes, again, help us navigate in a complex world. They can come in handy, but they can also lead us to make major illogical and unethical mistakes. We also talk about stereotyping, which is when you draw inferences of others based on the category we place them in. Again, you can think of, you probably heard this example before, but resumes. So it's all studies show that if you change the name of resumes, they are reviewed differently. Another bias that's very important when we talk about stereotypes is the halo effect. And the halo effect is the tendency for positive impression of a person, a company, a brand in one area to positively influence one's opinion or feelings in other areas. Normally, when we talk about stereotypes, we talk about negative stereotypes. I mean, affecting in a negative way. This is actually the opposite. The halo effect is our that, for example, like I said here, like beautiful equals good. That we assume that people that are physical attractive, that are dressed nicely, also possess socially desirable qualities. Basically, we like beautiful people because they're beautiful. That's how our brain works. The same goes for tall. Tall means competent leader. A lot of studies has also been done on measuring the average height of men, and apparently it shows out that the average CEO is taller than the average man. So either the CEO is just taller, we cannot explain it, or maybe we have this tendency to think that tall men are or must be more natural leaders, that we give them other quality just because they're tall. Yeah, so this was a little about what bias does to us, and also a little about stereotyping. Now I would like to do just a small exercise with you, and I would like you to just do it, well, individually. It's a little difficult to do it otherwise, but still. I put a word here that says career women. So if you could just take like a couple of seconds to just whatever image comes to your mind when you think of a career woman. Yeah. So we have a picture here of a career woman. And probably in somehow or in some ways she matched maybe the image you had, and in other ways you probably did not. So this woman is pregnant, and one thing that a lot of people consider either consciously or unconsciously is if pregnant women can be career minded. And if she is career minded, even though she's pregnant, what will happen once she delivers the baby? I'm sure her priorities will change once a mother. And we cannot really count her in because we don't know what her priorities will be when she's given birth. This is, maybe you will be surprised, but this is a story that we've encountered like really, really from a lot of women during the podcast, that young mothers experience that work attitudes towards them changed after they became mothers. So another example, a board member. Again, I will just give you some time to kind of yeah. And I won't comment too much on this one. Just maybe do your own thought processes on how this person match or does not match your image or the images you had in your mind. If you think of a CEO, here we have Natasha Al-Hariri. She is actual CEO in Defunk, which is a Danish non-government organization working with young refugees. Next word is government. So I'm guessing now that this is maybe what you actually had in mind. This is, well, at least this to me is like a very stereotypical government. However, last year we had the Finnish government being chosen, and this is the Finnish prime minister and three ministers of the Finnish government. And they were celebrated globally because, well, they are young women. But at the same time, there was also an outrage. Like people started asking, where is the diversity in this government? It's very female centric. The thing is that the Finnish government has 20 ministers in total. 7 of the ministers are men. That means that they have a 35% gender distribution. That is actually the exact same distribution we have in Denmark, where just reversed, where we have 35% of our ministers being female. So what's interesting about the Finnish government is that whenever you have too many women represented, or let me rephrase that, if you have women represented in a crowd, they don't have to count for half of the crowd before you actually feel that they are overwhelming or taking up too much space. Hollywood did, or some people did a really interesting study of Hollywood movies where they looked into what is the magic percentage of a crowd in order for you to feel that they're like equal representation. And do you have a guess, Pernille? What would you say?
I'm afraid now, no. I think it's Gina Davis who's done a lot of work on it. I don't want to hazard a guess.
No, I understand you. Yeah. So I can tell you the magic number is 17. In most crowd scenes in movies, only 17% of the people in the crowd are women. Of course, this also goes for other minorities and with an even lower represented. So the reason this is that when a group in society has long been underrepresented in media, everywhere, an increase in representation, no matter how small, can be perceived as an onslaught. So if we see 4 young female ministers, it feels like they are taking up a lot of space, whereas if it were 4 middle-aged men, it would seem more normal. Okay, so I just went through a lot of examples of biases, stereotypes, etc. And before we move into how biases affect our design processes, I just want to kind of sum up how we can work with our own biases in regards to stereotypes, gender norms, etc. And I don't have all of the answers, of course. I mean, I've spent 2.5 years diving into this, and you can never really break free of your biases or stereotypes. But what you can do is to become aware of them and start noticing whenever they pops up, and then you can kind of reflect and maybe try to change your thought processes. But one thing you can do is to counterbalance your biases. By counterbalancing, I mean that the more counter stereotypical examples you meet, the more you will become aware of your unconscious stereotypes and maybe break free from them. For example, the female mason will be a counter stereotypical example. A male nurse, disabled models. I just heard a story about one. Black professors. So all of these, if you meet real person that can counter your biases, your stereotypes, this will make you change your ideas and perceptions of the world. What you also can do is that you can build a system around it, and here you can think of the pilot's checklist. So before takeoff, the pilot has to go through a list of things that he or she there it was again, that he must check. And also we have the co-pilot doing the same, and this is because pilots know that human are we fail all the time. I mean, we make mistakes, that's human. So in order to counterbalance this, they make a list that you have to go through. The same you can do in other processes. For example, for recruitment, you can remove names or other identity markers from the resume. So try to kind of remove the biases as long in the process as you can, is another example. Okay, so how does bias and stereotypes affect our design processes? And now I will try to maybe move a little more into the circular sphere. Before I do that, I have to just share this with you, because what I discovered is a lot of things have changed in 70 years, and also a lot of things have not changed. The reason why I chose 70 years is because we have these two major books. So we have in 1949 Simone de Beauvoir publishing a book called The Second Sex. Simone de Beauvoir was she was the first philosopher and thinker to do a systematic review of how the female sex has come to be seen as the second sex throughout history, meaning that the female has always been contrasted to the male being the default and the female being some kind of deviation. I mean, you can think of Eva, origin from Adam's rib, and then just go forward from there. This is 1949, so a lot of things have changed, and then again, a lot of things have not changed. Last year, a new book was published called Invisible Women by Carolina Criado Perez, and I can really recommend it. I brought it here. If you're interested in this, I can recommend this book. This is a systematic review of how women are still being left out or forgotten in big data and in design processes. And it's important here to say that it's not because somebody wants to exclude women or other minorities or on purpose leave them behind. It's again because we tend to think about the man as the default. And this is not just men doing this. I mean, it's also women using the man as a default. And this is also what I will give you some examples of. Now, diving into design processes. So I like this example because it's pretty basic or pretty simple, but it says a lot. So here we have a soap dispenser activated by a sensor. So we have a hand activating the sensor, receiving some soap. Here we have a black hand trying to activate the sensor. The thing is, the sensor only works on white hands. This is not because some developers or product designers thought, okay, we want to make a soap dispenser that only works for white people. It's not because they wanted to discriminate, but they ended up doing it either way, because they did not even care to think about skin color being a factor in designing, well, something for a soap dispenser. When the black hand took a piece of white paper, he was able to receive some soap. So yeah, just one example. If we move on, this and the following examples are all from the book, the Invisible Woman book. Now we will just take a short trip to Sweden. This is a town called Karlskoga. And in Sweden, well, they have a lot of policies about gender equality. So this town had to go through re-evaluation of all their policies through gendered lens. What they asked themselves is that, well, snow clearing, how can that be sexist? And that's what you would think. Of course, snow clearing cannot be sexist. But they discovered that women do tend to have different travel patterns than men. Women still globally do 75% of the unpaid care work. So still today, a lot of women do like the grocery shopping, picking up children after school, etc. So what they found is that women tend to have like small interconnected trips, whereas men tend more to have a simple travel pattern where they do a twice a daily commute in and out of town. So what the Swedish counselors learned is that they had to switch their snow clearing priorities in order to meet actually the needs of the women. So instead of clearing the roads first, as they did before, they started clearing and prioritizing pedestrians and public transport users. And this actually ended up saving them money, because they also discovered by doing this that pedestrians are injured and hospitalized 3 times as much as motorists are in slippery, icy conditions. So they ended up saving like huge amount of money just by changing this. Again, the original like snow clearing schedule was not designed to benefit men at the expense of women, but it was designed or scheduled by men who knew how they traveled, and they kind of designed it around their needs. So here it's like an example of the gender bias gap, or data gap. If we go from Sweden to Brazil, we have a public housing project called My House, My Life. What they wanted to do is actually help a lot of families move out of the favelas and give them better housing opportunities. But what they also did is they placed the housing project 70 kilometers outside the city, not considering that a lot of the women did not have access to cars. Also, there were no direct public transportation access. They also designed the apartment for the nuclear family, which did not match the situation of these families. They designed the complex with privacy in mind rather than with community in mind. Again, a clear shift away from the favela life. And there was no possibilities for childcare in the area. So in many, many ways, again, this project was designed without the need of the actual people in mind, and with a lot of data gender gaps. We have just like train stations. In the UK Department for Transport found that 60% of women are scared when they're waiting on trains on platforms. 60% are scared walking home from a bus stop or a train station. There's a lot of fear going on for women, and studies from Finland, Sweden, the US shows that women actually adjust their behavior and travel pattern to accommodate this fear. So they They avoid specific routes, times, modes of transport, etc. However, a lot of transit authority and a lot of the transit sector is still very male-dominated workforce. So we tend to focus on security, for example, if accidents happen, security instead of safety, which ultimately can have a negative impact on women's freedom of movement. You probably know this one, the crash test dummies. Women are 47% more likely to be seriously injured or die in a car crash than men are. One of the reasons is that the crash test dummy is designed with the male anatomy in mind. They do have a female version, but she's basically just a downscaled male with boobs. This is my personal example, or one of them. This is the Apple Watch. Or in 2014, Apple launched its health monitoring system. They were very proud of their comprehensive health tracker. With this, you could track blood pressure, steps taken, blood alcohol level, but they forgot one crucial detail. Do you have any guesses as to what that could be?
No.
No? So what they did not include in this health monitoring system was a period tracker.
Of course.
And well, they did actually put in a tracker for copper intake, but they forgot the most crucial thing to track for 50% of their users. So again, I mean, women cannot have designed this health monitoring system because they would, of course, have thought about their periods while designing this. Okay, so this was a lot of examples of how bias and data gaps affect our design processes. So now I'm a little curious. Both, you're very welcome also to put in questions in the comment field. But Pernille, I'm a little curious also on your take on all of this, because as I mentioned in the beginning, I don't have a lot of knowledge of circular economy, but when we started talking about bias, stereotypes, gender norms, and circular economy, you were very fast to kind of link the two. So could you just elaborate a little on, I mean, why is it interesting to like discuss the two together?
Yes, and while you may be commenting and asking questions, this is we have discussed this. We've had a few meetings and conversations, and Naja and I decided that you would actually ask me questions as well. So, and I don't know the questions. And the reason why I thought that this could be of real value to place as a science talk and raise the awareness of the unconscious bias is that whenever we talk about circular economy and the need, I think that we quite quickly become we agree on the need, the impetus for circularity. I think the staggering amount of waste. I think IKEA at some point they had the epiphany that they wanted to launch and expand their market to Asia, and they had already tried it. And I think everybody knows the first experience, namely that they thought that they could just ship the furniture. It's actually a very good design example, that they would just launch the existing furniture created to the Nordic and the European markets, and they would sell them in Asia. And of course, they realized that the measurements were completely off. So they had to redesign the furniture. So as they did that, they calculated the need for resources. And they realized that if IKEA were to expand and become a global company selling globally, they alone would use 3 times the resources of the earth. And that in itself made them stop and say, okay, that's just not feasible. So I think that is a very good example of the need to leave the linear economy, the model of take, make, and waste, the phrasing that Ellen MacArthur Foundation uses. And the reason why I thought that this was interesting to kind of, as I also said, to bring the human touch to the circular economy debate, is that I think that when we make decisions by default, when we're not aware of our unconscious decision making, it's really, really difficult to change the paradigm. And from a scientific, like the knowledge of science, we do know that the shifts of paradigms, they take time, and they take a lot of time. And it's not just done with one day, it's not just done within a year. It takes a lot of knowledge, it takes a lot of experiences. And I think part of what you've also mentioned, we cannot just change the way that our unconscious works. It also has a lot of benefits because we make a lot of decisions every day. But we need to, when we are making that change, and we already are embarking on that change, and so many initiatives have been launched already, I think we need to explicate the unconscious biases in our design processes. Because if you look at some of the housing areas that are actually created, where they want to base it on the circular economy, they want to do the upcycling, they want to reuse materials, and they are identifying all of the obstacles in that process. And some of them also will return to the word cloud, but a lot of people will know that we need a new business model, we need a new pricing system, we need procurement. The structural change is so evident when you're working with it, but the structural change also hides the unconscious. So I think that's why when we had our first conversation, I kind of merged the two needs, or the two discussions and themes together. And I thought that this talk that we're having today could be one way also to ensure that the ongoing change and insurance of implementing circularity can take that step forward, as it were.
Yeah. Yeah, and another thing also I remember you mentioned is the focus on materials in the talk of circular economy, whereas human resources, as I understood it, is not taking up that much of the discussion.
No, it's I think, and some of you watching will know this as well as I, that there is a focus on collaboration, and there is a focus on strategic partnerships, and there is a focus on public-private partnerships. But that focus is extremely valid and extremely correct. But behind that focus, we have the human resources. And is it so that we also need to have a checklist like the pilot? Is it so that we actually need to make sure that the co-pilot is different to the pilot, etc.? It's those kind of small steps that I think we need to pose. And we actually have a question. Thank you, Zachary. This is wonderful. We have a question. What is driving between? This is a good question. And this is to you and Naja. What is driving the difference between the perception of gender equality in Denmark and the lived reality?
So what is driving the difference?
Yeah, between the perception of gender equality in Denmark and then the actual equality. So as you're saying that we would assume that there is equality in Denmark, but the numbers that you mentioned actually speak a different reality.
Yeah. This is actually really, it is a really interesting thing to... One of the things that happened in Denmark compared to Sweden and Norway is the way that equality was handled after the 70s. I mean, so back in the 60s, 70s in Denmark, we were actually pretty well off. We were some of the first on many levels. But then we were kind of, okay, we did a pretty good deal. Now everybody's equal. I mean, 2000 years, we fixed it in a couple of years. And then the discussion kind of stopped in Denmark, and we thought it was very much like a private thing, that you had to be equal back in your homes with your wife, your husband, your kids, and it was like an individual matter. Whereas in Sweden and in Norway, it became a political discussion as well. So they did not stop where we stopped. They actually looked into policies, like Sweden looking into, okay, putting on the gender lens, and actually going one step deeper. And I think that's what's missing in Denmark, that we kind of thought that we are so good and with that we managed it already, so we don't have to take care of it anymore. And that's very dangerous. You can see the same actually with female CEOs. So if a company has had a female CEO, likely you will have like a male CEO after her, and maybe a long time without any female top level managers, because now you had one, so now you don't have to have more. It's kind of the same logic. So I don't know if that kind of answers the question, and I can go much more into this, but
and otherwise keep asking, Zachary, if you have more questions to that, because it is interesting in terms of taking it from the individual and the structural and tying it back to the circular economy, that a lot of endeavors are actually made at a structural level at the moment. And we've seen it actually as part of the recent situation that we're all facing globally. And in Denmark, what we have is that we have allowed the public sector to actually spend a lot more money on building, which was seen as a very good thing. And the criticism was then, why not ask all of those new products or projects, all these new building initiatives should be based on green initiatives. So now there is kind of an impetus or a push to make that happen. So that is a structural, so it is not left to the individual. And I think so it's an interesting take on it. So you could.
A good example could also be parental leave. So in a lot of countries, you can see that fathers take as much parental leave as is like
the minimum.
Yeah, the minimum, or which is their leave and not shared leave with the mother. And it does not matter if it's 10%, 20, 30%. But they take as much as is theirs. And this is a structural thing that can actually help us to create more equality. Anyways, we don't have to go deeper into that either.
But thank you, Zachary. Very good question.
Should I move on? Because I just have like the last part of my presentation, and it won't be too long, but it's about how bias affect, or what they do to our decision making processes. So, and this will not be in any ways exhaustive, or I will not like touch upon all kind of biases here. I will just give a couple of examples. We have the affinity bias, and first of all, it's important to remember that humans are social beings. This is basically what I study as an anthropologist as well. But we adjust to each other within a social group. And we like to draw boundaries between us, meaning the people within the group, and them, meaning people outside the group. So this is also kind of basic human functioning. We also tend to think that the group knows better. And this is often what happens when you do like an around the table discussion, that people tend to confirm, reinforce, or elaborate on the first statement made instead of bringing new perspectives to the table. One reason why we're doing this is the affinity bias. So affinity bias is the unconscious tendency to get along with others who are like us. It is easy to socialize and spend time with others who are not different. And the affinity bias is one of the huge reasons why we tend to hire people that are similar to ourselves. So affinity bias is a huge challenge to diversity. And again, back to Margrethe Vestager, when we look the same, we think the same. The reason for this is also because of the confirmation bias. So confirmation bias is a bias that explains to us that we seek information, or we tend to seek information that confirm what we already believe. And we also downplay or ignore information that might contradict what we believe. So if we have a strong opinion or any opinion, we tend to seek information that confirm that opinion and not to challenge it. This happens within groups that look alike. And this bias is really important also in regards to what is happening when a group becomes blind to other perspectives. So just to list some advantages and risk of this homogeneous group. So advantages are that we can easily relate to and understand each other, like the affinity bias, like we feel like we already know each other. And therefore, it's also faster and easier to reach a decision. Risks are that we are more vulnerable to the confirmation bias. We design to and for this default male that I talked about before, and not for the actual user or consumer. And we miss a lot of business opportunity, basically. So to give you an example, Lehman Brothers. The collapse of Lehman Brothers was very much due to an ethical slippery slope. So confirmation bias also makes you blind for ethical dilemmas. After the financial crisis, many people began wondering and studying, so which companies manage better or worse and why. And what's really interesting is that, of course, many factors come into play, but studies in France, the US, Europe indicate that the more women a company has in top positions and in boards, the less is the loss during financial crisis, and the higher is the return on equity. And this is not because women are better. I mean, this is about bringing diverse perspectives into a group of directors or a board. So you could say that confirmation bias and also being too big to fail are some of the reasons why Lehman Brothers crashed, and of course many other reasons. But that made me wonder, so if you called it Lehman Sisters, like would it be any different? But then my boyfriend made me aware that that's also not very diverse. So maybe some kind of like Lehman Rainbow. I mean, the point is that we should seek diversity within decision processes to make sure that we don't forget any important details, or and this is also why that Goldman Sachs actually announced this year in January that now at least one diverse board member is needed for companies to go public. So Goldman Sachs actually learned from the financial crisis that, okay, it is actually a good idea to have a diverse board member. So if you should also sum up some of the advantages, risks on heterogeneous groups, you could say that advantages are that they do have less blind spots. We tend to see more innovation and creativity from the different perspectives. We get better and more qualified decisions because we tend also to challenge our decisions more. Better understanding of market and consumers. The risks are that you have higher risk of conflicts and disagreement. I mean, you have a lot of different, maybe sometimes contrasting views, and it can be very time consuming. So it's not all like good. Of course, you have to also take into account that you need more time on developing and doing the decision processes and everything. I think that's actually just to sum up my presentation, how to break the square. So I made 3 takeaways, and I think afterwards we can discuss and challenge. You're very welcome to challenge as well. But one thing that to me is very useful is to remember Margrethe Vestager, what she said, that if we look the same, we think the same. So confirmation bias, I mean, if we're a group of the same kind of people, we tend to think the same, and also to become aware of your biases and to create a system to counterbalance them. Again, you won't be able to switch them off, but you can learn to register when they come into play and you can counteract their influence if you're aware and make some systems. And then the last thing is to invite diversity into your team and design processes. And I know this can be a long process also, but what you can do is that you can keep an open mind. You can actively seek the perspectives of others. So ask people different from yourself how they perceive the world, and always play like the devil's advocate on your own decisions and processes. Yeah.
Excellent. And while we actually got another question, which ties very well into the takeaways, and thank you to Christina for this question. In order to overcome this needing to go from the unconscious to overcome the inequality and the lack of diversity and designing by default, we need to go from unconscious to conscious. So the first question is actually, how do we do that? Which you have, but we can dive into that a bit more. And the follow-up question, do we have any examples of how unconscious bias affects our city planning, our public spaces? I think this is two brilliant questions. Thank you very much, Christina, because that's part of also some of the things that we were hoping that we would have a chance to discuss. So going from the unconscious to the conscious, I think this is also what you're tapping into in terms of your takeaways, but it leads to the follow-up kind of question, and there has been so many debates about that, so I think you won't be surprised when I say, do we need to think about quota? Do we need to think of a diversity assurance policy, if you like, or is keeping an open mind, is it enough? Is it kind of having the design code of conduct, seeking new perspectives, etc., or how can we make these checks and balances, as it were?
Well, I think in Denmark, the politicians are too afraid to ever go into the quota, and also a little afraid to discuss other things in regards to gender. But what I'm really glad to see is that the last couple of years, a lot of companies, organizations are actively doing something, and they are setting up their own diversity goals. A lot of the international companies with a Danish-based branch. We talk with some of like the bigger companies that tell us that they are doing something now, also because they can feel the pressure globally, but also they feel the pressure from their clients. I mean, and not just from clients, but also from attracting new talented employees actually to the company. That now it's not just a matter of if you think this is a topic or not. You actually, as a company, you start feeling the pressure from the outside. And I think that's really what can change something. And when we talked to Margrethe Vestager, she actually advised us to look into the climate debate for the gender debate, and maybe look at how companies, organizations that are doing something now, what they're doing, and what can we learn from them. So back to quota, I mean, in some ways quota do work, in some ways there's still a lot of pitfalls there. I think that one thing that is important is that to often in Denmark we tend to contrast qualification with gender or diversity. I think we should try to change our ways of thinking of this so that diversity is a qualification. Of course, it's not the only qualification. You only reach that level if you're already qualified. But being woman, being Black, being Muslim can be an additional qualification that your team needs to go further.
So part of the going from the unconscious to the conscious is actually seeking the diversity. So because we cannot eradicate our need to be with the people that look like us, or surrounding us with people in a colloquial term, don't surround ourselves with yay-sayers. But having said that, there's nothing as lovely to be confirmed, right? So one thing can be actually seeking to actually explicitly say, okay, do we have diversity in our team? The other thing, and I like that you touch upon that, is that there's actually a demand, because as you're risking the advantages and disadvantages, there's also a business case for this, and that of course links us, or kind of leads us into to the circular economy. That part of what we also need to illustrate and convey is that there is actually a demand. We can get back to that as we will ask you to vote in a few minutes, but I just want to touch upon Christina's second question, namely if we do have any examples on the unconscious and what that means to urban design. And from a diversity aspect, I'd like to actually raise one very, very vivid example of an unconscious bias in urban planning, and that basically goes in with people with a disability. If you have tried to navigate in Copenhagen, if you're in a wheelchair or you have a walking frame, you realize just how difficult it is. If you enter a public building in Sweden, the toilets for disabled are always on the ground floor. Whereas if you enter most of public buildings, you will sometimes, interestingly enough, find the one toilet for disabled on the top floor. I've traveled a lot in Sweden, and it's an enigma to me. Who would put it on the top floor? So that's one example. Another example you raised upon it is the sense of security. And I think for some of you, we all know that in Copenhagen, the main attraction, or we don't have a lot of green parks, actually. We don't have as many recreational areas as we would like to think. So a lot of people use the parks for running. It is not that many years ago that they put in special lights for runners that would run late at night to ensure the feeling of safety in parks along the lakes in Copenhagen, both in Fælledparken and in Frederiksberg. So that's just two examples in terms of trying to navigate and another diversity aspect of our own fair city. For those of you who are not in Copenhagen, but from an age perspective, Copenhagen is not that inclusive anymore. It has become a city for the young people. So a lot of the urban spaces that have been designed are for the young people. We want to exude life in Copenhagen, and we all do really love that. But it's not as easy anymore for our elderly population that are still part of this wonderful city. So thank you, Christina. Keep bringing those questions. And I'm not sure, but the word cloud came up with some very interesting words. And what I've tried to do, so if I at any point looked as if I were very, very concentrated, it was because I tried to tie in the words that you actually mentioned, and some of you have already been ranking them. So I can say that, because I asked the question that we've asked, is select as many as you can in terms of the order of ensuring the circular economy. So what Naja is showing you at the moment is the 12 things you can choose from. And I will tell you that the ranking from those of you who've actually been in and have ranked them, that you're listing one of the aspects that is really important when we're working on implementing the circular economy is carbon footprint. It is building materials, it is education, and it's paying attention to everyday life. And I think that is quite interesting in terms of what we have discussed so far. Ethically sourced, and then waste. And I think to comment on some of the things that we've looked at, I think it is absolutely true that if we want to make sure that the circular economy can also become transparent, so that we're able to show and illustrate that making the transition to the circular economy makes a positive change, we need to be able to demonstrate the positive results that it'll bring about, namely a reduction in carbon footprint. The building materials, I know that some of you would be engaged in what some people call the material passport. So that would be able to track a material, that we would be able to build for disassembly, so that we become much more knowledgeable and aware that when we construct, that we know exactly each material that we source for that construction, what are the carbon footprints from each material, and how can that material be upcycled or recycled. And of course, it is very nice to see that you do believe that education is important. You're all welcome still. It could change as you go in and rank, but it is interesting. And I think Naja has actually has done some interviews in other aspects of education when we've talked about that, the value of role models and the perceived awareness amongst students, what they see as their future perspective. So there is a massive potential positive power in education, but also the awareness that we need to reduce the waste or look at waste as a different resource. Now somebody has put in the attention to everyday life, so that when we're making that change, that it becomes important. Okay, I'm just asking, are there any more questions? You're more than welcome to pose questions or comments.
Well, I can ask you a question.
Yes.
While we're waiting for a
Yes.
question, because to me it would be very obvious that the diversity bias discussion is also part of the circular economy,
Yeah.
and the gender and other minorities or minorities. But what I wanted to ask you is that is it something that, or is this discussion taking place within discussions of circular economy, or how do you see it?
I think the discussions that I have been privy to so far, we still look at the systemic need for change, which I think is absolutely correct, that we do need that. We also, there's a lot of focus on the possibility of technological advances. So for example, tracking or insurance transparency, I think is a better way of putting it, that we need to be transparent about the building processes, so that we would be able to then document the reduction in waste, the carbon footprint, etc. And I think that the tacit assumption is that the paradigm of the circular economy, the change of the value chain, the change in language, that in itself will also imply diversity. So it is not something that is explicated. We talk about standardization, technological advances and opportunities, and we're also talking about the need for new business models. But more importantly, and I think that is some of the things that will be unfolding as we become much more experienced. We have Danish companies that are becoming so knowledgeable about what this actually means, and what they're also raising as a need is that each part of the value chain. Today we have a complex value chain in the building sector, but those roles in the value chain will change. And I think that is very interesting. And I think maybe that will then lead to the next aspect of cross-collaboration, the need for diversity in every aspect of the decision-making processes. And we do see some experiments and some pilot projects, and also some extremely ambitious initiatives that are supporting that kind of cross collaboration. Yeah. And I'm just checking. So far, no more questions. So, yes, thank you, Naja.
Well, thank you.
This has been really, really interesting, and I hope for you participating, it has also been equally interesting. I just want to, the human touch that we have focused a lot on today, I would also like to say that the potential financial advantages of restructuring to a circular economy within Europe's mobility, food industry, and the building sector is estimated to till the year 2030 to be 1,800 billion euros a year. So just as you presented a business case for diversity, the source from growth within, a circular economy vision for the competitive Europe, actually estimates that the transition to the circular economy for every year till 2030 will provide us of a potential advantage of 1,800 billion euro per year. So that's probably an interesting number given the current situation, where we would also like to make sure that we come out of the corona situation that we're all still facing with a more positive and optimistic future. So we're coming close to the end. I would like everyone with us today to thank you so much for joining us. A huge thank you to you, Naja. It has been an extreme pleasure having you in our studio at Bloxhub. I also hope that today's talk has contributed to the important part of the circular economy discussion and the transition to the circular economy, that when it comes to change and creating new solutions, the change starts with us, and it starts with the decisions we make every day, conscious or unconscious, and that's why we need to become much more aware of the unconscious. Knowledge and experience do go hand in hand. We depend on both to make that change. But we also depend on being able to create new knowledge. We depend on being able to create new experiences to make that step towards new paths and reach the sustainable solutions. From Bloxhub, thank you to everyone behind in the Bloxhub crew, and thank you to you. We will actually be back with another Science Talks in only 2 weeks, looking at the value chain of the circular economy. You can read much more about that on bloxhub.org. And for those of you who've been so good to email me and ask, will this transmission actually be saved and distributed? Yes, it will be available on our YouTube channel and hopefully also on our website from the beginning of next week. So thank you again. For those of you who are celebrating our Constitution Day tomorrow, I wish you a great Grundlovsdag. It is always a good thing to remember that the democracy is still around, so we should always remember to celebrate our Constitution. But thank you very much to every one of you, and have a very good day. Bye from us.